Narcissism. It's a word we hear all the time, right? We use it to describe celebrities, maybe a boss, or even an ex. But what if the real story behind this trait goes way deeper than we think? What if it actually starts in childhood? To really get that, we have to travel back, way back.
You've probably heard the myth of Narcissus. It's a pretty intense warning, isn't it? It perfectly captures that core idea of narcissism, a self-love so consuming it literally destroys you. The ancient Greeks gave us the story, but it's modern psychology that's trying to find the source. And that leads to a very modern and very tricky question. And that is the big question we're tackling today. We're moving from ancient myths to hard science to ask, are people born narcissistic or are they made? I mean, can the way you raise your kids actually create a narcissist? Let's dive in and see what the research says. So here's our game plan. First, we'll get a solid definition of what narcissism really is. Then, we'll look at its 4 surprisingly different faces. After that, we'll clear up the confusion between a narcissist and a psychopath, jump into that huge nature versus nurture debate, and finally, ask, could this all just be a normal phase kids go through?
All right, let's start at the beginning. When psychologists talk about narcissism, what do they actually mean? Because it's not just about being a little vain, it's a specific set of traits that they've been studying for a very long time. At its core, the psychological definition is all about this inflated, grandiose self-image. It's the unshakable belief that you're just, well, better than everyone else, smarter, more attractive, more important. And because of that, you feel you deserve special treatment. That right there is the engine that drives almost all narcissistic behavior.
But here's where it gets interesting. Narcissism isn't just one thing. Psychologists generally break it down into 2 main types. You've got grandiose narcissism. That's the classic version we all imagine, the loud, dominant person who just has to be the center of attention. But then there's vulnerable narcissism. This one is way quieter, more reserved on the outside, but underneath, they have that exact same powerful sense of entitlement and are incredibly sensitive to criticism.
Okay, so let's peel back another layer. If we go beyond just those 2 broad categories, some experts, like the psychologist Dr. Ramani Dravesula, have actually identified 4 distinct subtypes of narcissism. And this is where you start to see how differently this trait can actually show up in people's lives.
So these are the 4 big ones: grandiose, malignant, covert, and communal. Let's break each one down, because trust me, they do not all look the same.
First up, you have the grandiose type. Dr. Romani has this great line where she calls it the Chanel suit of narcissism. It's the classic model, you know? This is your typical arrogant, validation-hungry person who genuinely believes the world revolves around them. No surprises here.
But then things take a much darker turn with the malignant narcissist. Imagine the grandiose type, but with a seriously cruel, antisocial layer on top. They've got all that entitlement, but as Dr. Ramani puts it, they're also really mean. These are the types who will lie, cheat, and hurt people without a second thought to get what they want.
Next is the covert narcissist, and this one can be really tough to spot. Their grandiosity is hiding behind this mask of victimhood. Their whole story is, the world just doesn't get how great I am. They tend to be passive-aggressive, super insecure, and will absolutely lash out if they feel criticized in any way.
And finally, the communal narcissist. This one is so fascinating. They get their narcissistic supply from being seen as the most helpful or most caring person in the room. You know, the person who's always posting about their volunteer work. The motivation isn't really to do good, it's to get applause for doing good. They need everyone to know just how selfless they are.
This brings us to something we absolutely have to clear up. We hear narcissist, psychopath, and sociopath thrown around like they're the same thing. They're not. And understanding the difference is key to, well, understanding the whole picture.
If you only remember one thing from this section, make it this. Every single psychopath is narcissistic, but not every narcissist is a psychopath. Think of narcissism as one of the ingredients, but psychopathy adds some other, much more dangerous stuff to the recipe.
So let's look at the breakdown. A lot of it comes down to their origin story and their capacity for remorse. A narcissist's behavior usually comes from a really fragile self-esteem, and they can feel shame, mostly because they care deeply about how people see them. A psychopath, on the other hand, is thought to be born that way, with different brain wiring. They feel zero guilt. And a sociopath is usually made by their environment, often learning to shut off empathy just to survive a traumatic childhood.
Okay, so this brings us right back to the main event. We know what narcissism is, we know the different types, and we know what it isn't. So where the heck does it come from? Is it baked into our DNA, or is it something that happens to us as we grow up?
And the answer from pretty much all the research is it's both. Studies on twins have shown a really strong genetic link. Yep, some people are just born with a higher predisposition to it. But that's only half the story. The environment, especially parenting and culture, plays a huge role in whether those genetic seeds ever actually grow.
And here it is. This is really the core finding of our whole explainer. Research has found this powerful connection between certain parenting styles and the kind of narcissism a child might develop. On one side, you have pedestal parenting, constantly telling your kid they're special, better than others, and overvaluing everything they do. That can lead straight to grandiose narcissism. But on the other side, cold, controlling, or even neglectful parenting can foster vulnerable narcissism, creating a deep wound of insecurity that gets covered up by entitlement.
Now, before anyone with kids starts to panic, we have to talk about a really important distinction. There is a world of difference between someone having narcissistic traits and having the full-blown clinical diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder. And this is absolutely critical when we're talking about kids.
So, while lots of people might act a little narcissistic from time to time, the actual clinical disorder, what's known as NPD, is way more rare. We're talking only about 1 to 2% of the entire population.
And this is the single most important takeaway for any parent out there. NPD is a diagnosis for adults, period. Why? Because so many of its traits, being self-centered, wanting attention, thinking you're the best, can be a totally normal, healthy part of just being a kid. A child acting selfish doesn't mean they're destined to become a narcissist.
So, let's wrap this up. What did we learn?
We saw that narcissism is a whole spectrum with 4 very different faces. We figured out that its cause is a classic 50-50 split between nature and nurture. And, most critically, we saw how parenting can really tip the scales, that putting a child on a pedestal or being cold and controlling can have a huge impact on who they become.
And all of this leaves us with a really tough question for the world we live in today. In a culture that seems to reward self-promotion and a look-at-me attitude on social media every single day, how do we teach our kids to have healthy self-esteem without accidentally pushing them into narcissism? Finding that balance might be one of the biggest challenges we face.